My name is Ariana Ahmed, and today I'm going to be talking about South Asian history. So before I get started, I just want to ask, how many of you guys have heard of the partition? If you've never heard of it and you're just like, oh my god, I don't know what that is, that's great, because that's what I'm here to talk about today. So the partition was one of the most notable and most devastating events in the recent history of Asia. The partition of India was one of the biggest human migrations in history, with millions of casualties that created religious segregation and led to the birth of a new country. I know a lot about the partition because the two countries involved, India and Pakistan, are the two countries that I'm actually from, and my family was part of the partition. And it's a very important historical event that's often not talked about enough, and I think it's really important that we talk and discuss it because it allows us to learn from their mistakes so we can make sure we don't do it in our futures. So for some pre-context, the partition was an event in the early 20th century, 1947 to be exact, where the British-ruled country of India was separated into two, into India and Pakistan. For a long time, Hindus and Muslims lived together peacefully in India, but the British government began pushing for a separation of the two religions. And Hindus and Muslims who used to live peacefully together began to turn on one another, neighbors would attack neighbors, and peaceful towns would just be fraught with crime and hate. And millions of Muslims from India fled north to Pakistan, and so many died on the way there from violence and disease. Nowadays, there are a lot more Muslims in India, in cities such as Hyderabad, where my family is from. But nonetheless, India continues to be a Hindu-dominated country. Just for some visual references, this is a map of South Asia. The yellow is India, the pink is another country called Bangladesh, and the blue is Pakistan. All of these areas were once under British Indian rule. Nowadays, these countries are separated into three. Although India is still larger than Pakistan, Pakistan is its own country and very important in its own right, and also a relatively new country. But aside from that, the partition had just some of the largest casualty rates in modern world events. It's estimated and not confirmed because records honestly weren't that great in that time period, but it's estimated that around 2 to 4 million people died during the partition. And there were so many reasons that people would die, but violence, assault, rape, arson, and sickness were all reasons. This could happen in India or on the journey to Pakistan. It happened both ways. But the partition was also a really big example of modern day segregation, and I think this is something that we can all kind of learn from to implement in the future. But when people think of segregation, they tend to think of American history, where people of color and white people were separated. But in this case, separation meant the separation of religions. Hindus and Muslims were completely separated, and they were also being treated with violence and hate by Hindus and by the British soldiers who were posted in India. And one really good quote to represent the partition is from the show Ms. Marvel. It's a new Marvel show that you guys might have heard of. And Ms. Marvel's mom in the show says every family has a partition story, which is very true. If you ask any Indian or Pakistani, they can probably tell you that their family has a partition story, whether it's about them fleeing to Pakistan or standing their ground and staying in India. But every family does have a partition story. And one of the last points, but also one of the most important points, is the birth of Pakistan, where I'm from. It split and became an independent country in the 20th century, and the British were very reluctant to let the land go. Although the British were the ones pushing for the separation, they also didn't want to lose that much territory, since that would mean they would also lose their cash crop. India was very popular for things such as masala chai, who many of you might have had. Next time you go to Starbucks, order chai latte, they're great. But chai was primarily produced by India, and so was many other spices, which we all know the British loved their spices. So in order to lose Pakistan, in order to separate the Muslims, which they wanted, they had to lose some of that ground. But it's estimated that around 17 million people emigrated from India to Pakistan during 1947, which is crazy. And of those, 2 to 4 million people died, so that's a pretty big percentage. So another quote to represent the partition is by Gandhi, who many of you guys have probably heard of. He says that partition is bad, but whatever is past, we only have to look to the future, which I think really represents what I feel about the situation, about how we have to take what we know about the partition and apply it to modern day politics so that we can stop something from like this from ever happening again. Because honestly, the partition was only 70 years ago. It wasn't nearly as long ago as people like to think. So in conclusion, the partition was arguably the most important event in Indian and Pakistani history. The partition of India was one of the biggest human migrations in the world, with millions of casualties that created segregation and led to the birth of a new country. Looking back on what went wrong in these historical events can help us do better in the future, in hopes that history doesn't repeat itself. Thank you for your time.